Dziękuję Państwu bardzo za obecność. Ja reprezentuję portal w gospodarce.pl i w polityce.pl. Cieszę się, że będę miała możliwość poprowadzenia go dla Państwa, dlatego że wiem, że temat jest niezwykle ważki, niezwykle gorący i bardzo tak naprawdę kontrowersyjny, nawet jeżeli nam Polakom się wydaje, że rezygnacja Unii Europejskiej z paliw kopalnych Rosji jest czymś naturalnym, oczekiwanym i właściwie powinna mieć miejsce już bardzo dawno temu, to wcale tak naprawdę nie jest. Zanim przejdziemy do dyskusji, to oczywiście przedstawię moich i Państwa gości. Witam Panią byłą minister klimatu i środowiska Annę Łukaszewską-Trzeciakowską. Witam serdecznie. Jest z nami pan europoseł, pan Michał Dworczyk. Witam również. Są z nami też eksperci reprezentujący PISM, czyli Polski Instytut Studiów Międzynarodowych, pan Tymon Pastucha, który jak może Państwo wiecie, a nie wiecie, uchodzi za naprawdę jednego z najlepszych ekspertów od sektora gazowego w Unii Europejskiej. Jest z nami też pan Paweł Pikus, który też uchodzi, albo może lepsze sformułowanie, jest wielkim ekspertem od sektora energetycznego, z którym znamy się bardzo dawno. Pan Paweł Pikus jest radcą prawnym i jest senior manager w firmie konsultingowej Ernst Young. Proszę Państwa, mamy 2025 rok i tak naprawdę dopiero teraz mówimy o tym, że Unia Europejska podejmuje bardziej radykalne działania na rzecz odejścia od importu surowców rosyjskich. Wydawałoby się, że 3 lata wojny powinny spowodować to, że już nikt nie powinien kupować nie tylko węgla, którego już rzeczywiście Unia nie kupuje, ale też nikt nie powinien kupować ani ropy, ani gazu rosyjskiego. Tak naprawdę nie jest. O ile oczywiście najczęściej i najwięcej słyszymy o tym, że gaz rosyjski i ropa płyną do Europy Środkowej, to czasami wydaje się, że trochę mniej słyszymy o tym, że gaz rosyjski ciągle płynie statkami też do Europy Zachodniej, do takich krajów jak Hiszpania czy Francja, czy też Belgia i tam w tych portach albo jest przerzucany dalej, albo odbierany bezpośrednio. Mało tego, nawet Niemcy są importerami gazu ziemnego z Rosji, aczkolwiek oczywiście w postaci skroplonej, bo wiadomo, że do terminali dopływają dostawy LNG. Myślę, że najpierw jak wyjdziemy od tej dyskusji, myślę, że warto zacząć od tego, dlaczego te 3 lata nie spowodowały tego, że Unia Europejska definitywnie powiedziała dość, nie kupujemy już surowców rosyjskich. Mówi się tak naprawdę o miliardach, dziesiątkach miliardów, czy nawet setkach miliardów dolarów czy euro, które zasilają budżet wojenny Rosji. Wiem, że pan poseł ma najmniej czasu dzisiaj dla nas, to poproszę pana o pierwszy taki komentarz i spostrzeżenie.
Bardzo dziękuję. Szanowni Państwo, Pani Minister, Szanowni Państwo. Ja tylko tytułem doprecyzowania, prawie 4 lata. Za chwilę miną 4 lata od pełnoskalowej agresji Federacji Rosyjskiej na Ukrainę, a przypomnijmy, że ten konflikt trwa od 2014 roku i od tego 2014 roku chyba nikt nie powinien mieć wątpliwości co do tego, jakim zagrożeniem jest Federacja Rosyjska, jak jest to nieprzewidywalny i agresywny kraj, a mimo tego, ze względów, trzeba powiedzieć to wprost, na chciwość, kraje europejskie cały czas były importerem węglowodorów z Federacji Rosyjskiej. I były i są, dlatego że warto doprecyzować, w 2024 roku zdaje się, że ze sprzedaży węglowodorów właśnie do Europy, do Unii Europejskiej, Federacja Rosyjska otrzymała 15 miliardów euro, które zostały przeznaczone właśnie na wojnę prowadzoną na Ukrainie. Więc z jednej strony Unia Europejska przyjmuje kolejne pakiety sankcji, z jednej strony przyjmuje kolejne stanowiska, ale z drugiej strony sama działa na rzecz tego, aby Federacja Rosyjska posiadała środki na prowadzenie tej napastniczej wojny. Dlaczego tak się dzieje, że po prawie 4 latach cały czas ten import ma miejsce? No, wydaje się, że to jest wynik braku determinacji i to nie są puste słowa, bo możemy spojrzeć na przykład Polski. Polska w ciągu kilku lat dzięki Baltic Pipe, dzięki gazoportowi uniezależniła się w 100% od rosyjskiego gazu. Zrezygnowaliśmy również z rosyjskiej ropy. No, to wszystko są twarde twarde fakty, które pokazują na to, że jeżeli jest determinacja ze strony rządu, że jeśli jest pewne pogodzenie się nawet z konsekwencjami, które są nieuchronne w takich wypadkach, ale nadrzędny jest ten cel, jakim jest zdywersyfikowanie i odcięcie się od węglowodorów rosyjskich, to da się to zrobić. Niestety Unia Europejska, czy wiele krajów Unii Europejskiej, które najpierw w ogóle pozwoliły Federacji Rosyjskiej zarobić gigantyczne pieniądze i realizować takie projekty biznesowo-polityczne jak Nord Stream, no to niestety po raz kolejny Unia pokazuje, jak duży jest rozdźwięk pomiędzy deklaracjami a rzeczywistością, a za wszystkim właśnie stoją olbrzymie pieniądze.
Dziękuję panie pośle. Mi się wydaje, że determinacja to jest ten drugi element, jednak ten, który jest najważniejszy, to są pieniądze. Czy źle mi się wydaje, pani minister?
No jakby absolutnie się zgadzam z tym, co powiedział pan minister Dworczyk, pan europoseł Dworczyk. Unia jest doskonała w pompatycznych deklaracjach, niezła w kolorowych slajdach, natomiast jeżeli chodzi o rzeczywiste, twarde działania, zwłaszcza w odchodzeniu od rosyjskich węglowodorów, to już jest dużo gorzej. I tak, myśmy się do tego przygotowali i myśmy i Baltic Pipe, i terminal LNG, i za chwilę FSRU, i interkonektory z Litwą, z Czechami, ze Słowacją, i zmiana technologiczna w Płocku, bo trzeba było zmienić technologię przerobu ropy w rafinerii płockiej, żeby przejść z ropy rosyjskiej na inne kierunki. To po prostu jest kwestia nakładów inwestycyjnych. Doprowadziliśmy do tego, że jesteśmy od węglowodorów rosyjskich wolni. Z ruskiego węgla zrezygnowaliśmy, zanim stało się to w Europie modne. Natomiast Europa deklaruje jedno, robi drugie i rzeczywiście do belgijskich, francuskich
terminals still receive
ruskim gazem.
Russian gas. It's all about finances. It's simply cheaper. The energy windy niemiecki, the German doctrine supported by Ms. Merkel. It turned out that the Russian gas is neither cheap nor guaranteed nor secured, but the doctrine changes slowly, especially when there are financial factors behind. The gas is still being pushed to German terminals. It used to be simply cheaper. When it comes to Nord Stream, it suffers from the politics and their lack of determination. And I'm not 100% convinced that Nord Stream will not be up once the war in Ukraine is over. Two more comments to what Mr. Dworczyk said. We know what Russia is. We've known that for 1,000 years. That's how long we've had them as a neighbor. So we have no doubts. We, the Eastern Europe, unfortunately, the West of Europe does not want to accept the truth, and they still believe that you can make business with Russia. And the other word of comment. The savings are apparent. The spending on becoming unreliable on Russian fuels are also apparent. In the long run, only the cutoff will support planning economy responsibly. The savings are short-sighted. What Ms. Merkel said are apparent savings. These are myths based on the belief that Russia is one of European countries. They not. Their thinking is not European thinking, and I'm afraid it'll never will be. It's an Eastern country with all the burden of that. And the last thing I wanted to say relates not only to gas but also to oil, and does not relate oil fed to Slovakia, Hungary, or other Central Europe, but countries with no access to seas. Russian
Oczywiście ona
oil
jest offshorowana w Kazachstanie, ale
is
nawet
fed
była
to
minister
German
przemysłu
terminals.
Niemiec
Of
przyznawała,
course,
że
is
te
under
molekuły się
Kazakh
w tym
flag,
rurociągu
but
mieszają i że gwarancji na to, że to nie
the
jest
molecules
rosyjskie
in the
źródło, wcale nie ma.
pipelines are there. There are no
Bo-
guarantees that
I
it's not
dlaczego tak
Russian
jest?
oil.
Dlatego,
Why
że
is it
technologicznie
so? Because
rafineria
technologically
jest stosowana do
fed
przerobu konkretnego
refinery
rodzaju ropy,
is
repko,
fine-tuned to
zamienione na
special
kepko,
type of
skład
oil.
chemiczny identyczny, to państwo sobie
Identical
dopowiedzą, skąd ta
chemical
ropa jest
composition, so
Także
it's easy to say where it
Rachunek
originated.
ekonomiczny ma znaczenie. W
So the
krótkim
bottom
okresie
line
czasu
does
tak,
matter
wymaga większych
in short
nakładów,
term,
jest droższe,
and in short term it
uniezależniejsze.
requires more
Rosyjskich
investment,
surowców w
but
dłuższym
in the
okresie
long
czasu
run
zawsze wychodzi na
it
dobre, jest
always
ekonomicznie
pays back
uzasadnione. I ja jestem
to
dumna
phase out.
jako
I'm
członek
proud as a
rządu,
member of the
premiera
government,
Morawieckiego,
of
z tego, że
Mr.
udało nam
Morawiecki's
się
government,
Polskę
that we
zupełnie od tej
succeeded
zależności
to cut
uwolnić.
off
I
that
jesteśmy jako Polska nie
supply,
tylko
and
niezależni, ale
we are
też
not
gotowi,
only
żeby w tej
independent,
niezależności wspierać
but
inne
also
kraje, bo nasze
willing to support other
terminale
countries
już
in
w
their
Świnoujściu, a
efforts.
za chwilę w Gdańsku,
Our
nasze
terminals in
konektory,
Świnoujście and soon in Gdańsk, our
rurociągów,
collectors,
gazociągów
our
są gotowe do
main
tego, żeby inne
pipes,
kraje i na
mains
zachodzie,
are
i na
ready to
południu
support other
w tym
countries,
uniezależnieniu
both to the west
też wspierać.
Dziękuję, pani minister.
and to the south
Mamy
of
taką
Poland.
sytuację, że mamy
Thank you.
19 pakiet sankcji
We've just had the 19th package of
19%
sanctions
gazu
and
importowanego
19%
przez
of
Unię
gas
Europejską
imported by the
pochodzącego z
European
Rosji.
Union coming from Russia.
Jak można to skomentować? O czym to świadczy?
How can that be commented? The question is quite complex. If we take a look at what was the level of imports from Russia in 2021, that was about 47%. So we have success. The change is enormous. You can see it on numerous examples as Poland, the Czech Republic, but also Germany. They significantly reduced their imports. In 2021, it was about 140 billion cubic meters sent annually from Russia to the European Union. Last year, as far as I remember, it was about 45 billion cubic meters, which is below the 15%. What is very positive, a positive signal from last weeks from our allies, especially bearing in mind the broader offensive that we witnessed last year, sanctions from the Great Britain, USA and the European Union aimed at further limiting the reliance. We'll get back to it in a second. Can we stay at diagnosing the situation? Thank you for the floor. I need to agree with the other panelists saying what happened after 2022. One thing I'd like to add is that we need to remember that 2022 was a breakthrough year, not only because some of the countries wanted to do what was done. Some countries were forced to do that with Gazprom's politics. If not for the policy, I'm not sure we would have seen as much phasing out or as dynamic as it is. At the turn of 21 and 22, Gazprom cut off some countries, Western and East Central European countries, from their supplies. Austria, if they could continue importing, they probably would have. But Gazprom hard play at the turn of 21 and 22 with their contracts. Our diversification policy played an important role then. After taking over or commissioning of the Baltic Pipe, we could sigh in relief observing what Gazprom was doing. Other countries that earlier did not see the threat and did not listen to Poland when we invested a lot in diversifying our infrastructure, be it the pipeline from Norway or the terminal, the countries had little time to change their policies. Germany is one of the examples. And they worked really hard to set up their terminals. We need to remember that the initial shock also slowly phased out. Wars, we get used to wars, and wars move off first pages of newspapers. And the same situation here. Some of the countries believe that all the situation will get calmer and we would be business as usual. And we can see that the terminals in Germany also gradually were moved somewhere else. It's because there was not enough demand. One of the outcomes was that the gas that reached Western European countries as LNG, it simply was distributed to other countries, and the initial shock faded. So it's true, Union is doing that, but is the pace sufficient, and is the level of determination sufficient? That's a good question. Is the new package of sanctions combined with the big efforts from Denmark and USA? Are these efforts, joint efforts, bound to succeed? We've had some joint efforts with Canada, with Japan, US, limits, price caps on Russian oil. But the outcomes were, let's put it mildly, limited. Do you think what we are about to see, will it be good change? As you've said, this is the 19th package. Each of the packages have brought certain outcomes, and so will this one, but none of them, including the 19th one, has not been a game changer. Russian economy will not collapse suddenly. We need to state that very clearly, and whoever believed otherwise is wrong. Russia will not be to their knees overnight. That'd be naive. But I do not want to depreciate these packages of sanctions. They do bring certain outcomes, results. I'd like to point out that Europe is doing too little for the declared level of determination. Let me give you some examples. The Shadow Fleet. Limitations on its operation only recently have been a bit better and still insufficient. For a long time, our efficiency in that respect has been really minimal. And I could be giving you much more examples. Russia is also adjusting to the new reality. They redirect their supply chains, trade routes to other parts of the world, and they are successful in that. So summing up, it will not change the fate of the war overnight, but me as a politician, I'm very happy to see any effort aimed at making it more difficult for the Russian Federation to operate, to function. It needs to be stated very clearly. The wrong will last long, that the Russian Federation has a lot of resources and they not passive in what they do, especially facing the limitation efforts from the rest of the world. Thank you. Tymon, are we really in a breakthrough situation? American, British sanctions, and on the other hand, the European Union, at least it seems so, is so determined that 2028 should be the first year without Russian oil and gas. The question is how much it is wishful thinking or how feasible that is. Because I've heard already certain voices that when it comes to energy security, there should be a back door open. How do you see these packages? Could you comment on the packages too? Let me comment to what Mr. Minister said. Sanctions do not bring fruit within 2 or 3 weeks. There are limitations of economic capacity, but actually it is difficult to say what is the outcome because Russia does not reveal any data. So we cannot be sure what are real results. Nonetheless, there are things we see. Inflation, very high interest rates, problems related to economic stability, income on oil and gas that make up majority of their budget. It used to be 40%, now it's 25%. So there are outcomes. And the package of sanctions will speed up the erosion of Russian economy, but it takes some time. Let me remind you what sanctions we've seen recently. Very strong blow of the US and the UK into the biggest oil and gas companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Rosneft used to be the biggest fuel company in the world. It'll start only on the 21st of October, but that's a huge blow. Russia, in its communication, was very surprised with the US approach. And we can see more and more messages signaling that they are determined to tighten the sanctions, bearing in mind the broader context and forcing Russia to sit at the negotiations table. We need to interpret that very positively. The EU's efforts, the decision to give up, to phase out Russian LNG is a decision we've waited for a long time. Be it not only months, but years. I certainly hope it'll happen sooner than in 2028, because that's when all the long-term contracts expire. But also, already within half year, we can see expiry of shorter-term contracts. So we can expect outcomes in the weeks to come. And we can pin hopes on that. Communicating sanctions to society as something that will start acting very shortly is unjustified. Whenever speaking on the EU, we say about phasing out of the EU from Russian raw materials, but we need to emphasize that what's very important is preventing Russia to export with high margins to other countries. The EU not buying Russian oil and gas does not mean that they will not be selling it to other markets like Chinese, Indian, which they have done so far successfully. That's true. And that's another element not only of the EU policy, because EU seems to be an actor not strong enough, but together with the UK, we can increase the cost of functioning the Russian energy sector and trimming their income that fuels the war in Ukraine.
And talking about the efficiency of this sanction coalition, how do you assess this, Minister? Will this be effective or not? This is the main question here. All this has already been covered. We cannot really see results overnight. And then the years in Western world's wishful thinking that we are the center of the world and we're stopping to be that. You mentioned that at the end, Turkey, India, China, we didn't see it in our approach. And this, the balance in the world shifts towards Asia, even though the US is boldly combating that. So first of all, to Rosneft, that's true, but Chancellor Merz said that the Russian part of Rosneft will not be covered by these sanctions. So we see the first resistance here. Chancellor Merz is putting the monkey into the works, really, protecting the German interest. Sanctions and Repower EU, so phasing out Russian fuels, have to be seen together in the provision proposed by the EU. They are not even mentioning petrochemical industries. Now, writing these regulations, we should be aware that most of the resources flows to Turkey or to India, where it's processed. And as a more high-margin product, it comes to Poland and other European countries as something that competes with our products, stamped as originating from India or Turkey, and does not originate from Russia anymore. And petrochemical industry is much more, its products have much higher markups than crude oil itself. So we are just providing profit to Turks or Indians and other economies, fueling demand actually for Russian raw materials, because for them it's more profitable. Only at the level of the European Parliament these amendments were implemented in commissions and for the petrochemical industry to be covered by that as well, and to prove the origin of molecules flowing into Europe, as these molecules of Russian fuels or Russian resources are flying to Germany and are invoiced in third countries. Using the right provisions in the Repower draft, there's an attempt to implement this. We will see what will come out at the end, because the Council and the Commission have to agree on these provisions, and we will see what comes out of it at the end. However, as I said, the example of Chancellor Merz in Rosneft shows that fighting for Europe to say that it's free of Russian resources, not at the cost of its political economies, is with us. And I'm not fully convinced at the end of the day whether this will succeed, as this entails a lot of money. Paweł, will we succeed or not? So we are seeing a geopolitical shift. So Europe has to take sides, really. So far, geopolitically, Western countries thought that it was okay to drift between superpowers, that you can be somewhere in between, and be the tip of the scale of US-CIS policy and be open at the same time to Eurasia. As we can see today, the world is different. And President Trump saying that, right, if you want me to impose more sanctions, you have to shape your trade policy not to support those who in fact are fueling the war machine of the Kremlin, as Minister said. So this is the choice we are facing today. At the same time, we have to remember who blocked Nord Stream 2. This was not Europe. These were not European sanctions or decisions of European countries. Germany, until the very end, were pushing forward towards completing this project, and this project was blocked by US sanctions. And Trump, during his first term of office, when he said that he's imposing sanctions on ships that were supposed to complete the construction of this pipeline, and its construction was not completed. It was blocked until the time when the war broke out, and it was not all right to finish it anymore. So Europe as a whole is facing the choice of its strategic independence, and it's great that we have these packages. It's a pity that they come so late, because we are at a juncture when it's great that we have this trade agreement between the EU and the US announced by Trump, colloquially saying that there will be hundreds of trillions or gazillions, 750, there will be many zeros, let's say, fuel bought from the US. We can see that this shift is happening, that US resources can flow to Europe in larger amounts, and because we as Poland are a great example with our two terminals and our contracts from 2018, 2021. Just recently we signed a contract of the second terminal, Venture Global, by Orlen. So We are witnessing a huge geopolitical shift. It's great that it's happening, and we just have to stay the course. MEP, can the US be the driver here, forcing Europe to bow down and to try to amend this regulation concerning the fact that in 2028 we will phase out fossil fuels from Russia? Will it be possible? Obviously, the US has various tools of pressure. We've already seen that after the negotiations with Ms. von der Leyen with President Trump. We saw specific decisions taken showing that the US has a lot of potential of exerting pressure on the EU. The question is how determined the US will be to utilize these tools. And the matter we are discussing today, we have to remember that the US today has to juggle many things more than just the European issues regarding their security. This is not just last year or the last 2 years. For a long time we've been seeing that the stress of US policy has been shifting from Europe to other areas of more importance today from the point of view of the US administration, and the US-China competition has its clear consequences. And the fact that Donald Trump is attempting to take steps, some people support it, some criticize it, is trying to finish or at least freeze the conflict, to have free resources in other areas of the world. This allows us to suspect that he will not be risking all his authority involvement to put Europe in the same rank and file as Russia or China, and to use some radical steps. This will not happen. I think the US is the most interested in freezing the conflict as soon as possible, to make it as good as possible from the point of Ukraine as well. But this is not an overarching goal for the US. At the cost of Ukraine, at the cost of European interests, they may try to gain some advantages for the US, and the advantages are greater for the US. I assume that the President Trump and the US administration will go for it. They will not really worry about this. They will not shed any tears. They are looking at the world through the lens of US interests. So let's talk about the US for a second. To what extent the expectations of Donald Trump that the EU will become the main purchaser, one of the main purchasers of US gas, resigning or phasing out Russian fuels. There's Qatar, Algeria, Norway. We're talking about natural gas here. These are other suppliers. But to what extent these expectations that the EU will import $250 billion worth of resources, because we've heard such figures, not for a year, but for 3 years. Now, to what extent can it in any way influence the steps of the European Commission and member states as far as purchasing is concerned? It seems that Donald Trump can have his expectations. Ursula von der Leyen can say, all right, okay, we'll do our best. But in fact, the Commission has nothing to say here. Nobody will force anyone. Brussels will not force a member state to purchase natural gas from any supplier. What's your take on this? So this is an interesting question. Now, if you were to take a closer look at the Brussels policy regarding fossil fuels from Russia and importing resources from the US, we can see that the Brussels position is very much towards limiting importing from Russia, but specific member states are an issue here. We listed Germany, that have Rosneft's assets controlled by the federal government. This is actually a laughable situation. So limiting the energy influence of Russia in Europe is forced by U.S. decisions. The U.S. has imposed sanctions against Russia and Lukoil, Let me remind you that these two companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, they have their refineries, one in the Netherlands, 3 in Germany, 1 in Romania, and 1 in Bulgaria. All these refineries, theoretically, should be sold to Western entities, or they should stop functioning by the end of October, if they do not prolong their operation. Another example is Serbia, where Russia controls the largest energy company, NIS, which also owns a refinery in Pančev, and the refinery was covered by the sanctions starting at the beginning of October. So these are US sanctions. The EU was unable to take such decisions. So we can see, I mean, the way I see it, I take a broader view of that, limiting economic impact of Russia in Europe. That's their policy. But who will fill this void? Who will take their place? To some extent, this will be the US. And we will be the natural importer of oil and gas from the US. We as the EU. We've been debating that. Some of the interlocutors, some of the panelists or partners from the Western world, or especially from Germany, are indicating that we are facing the risk of becoming dependent on the US. We're just switching Russia with the US. But it's incomparable. The US is a credible partner. At least they've always been so far. They've been supporting us. They are an ally. I mean, this is a bit of an oversimplification, right? We should be comparing apples. Shouldn't be comparing apples and oranges. I mean, you cannot really do that. There are such views. I mean, so this is an interesting picture here. If you look at economic data concerning imports, currently natural gas import from Russia, from the US, looking at the total import volume to the EU, if I recall, it's around 20-something%. Russia in 2021 took up 47%, so the scale of dependence on the US in the energy sector is not huge. So I expect this is a natural direction of economic development. Increasing these import volumes from the US will grow, but we don't know what the ultimate values will be achieved. But this results from specific member states' decisions or specific companies' decisions. So we are not sure about the outcome here. Probably this will be very difficult to achieve the level at the scale of Russia we had before. I think that Donald Trump just used these figures. He thought that the higher number he says, the better. Even if we achieve a half, it will not be best. Minister, what's your take on this? So this is a very complex picture, and it's difficult to unfold it. I warn people from focusing on just parts of the picture. We don't see the whole picture. It's very complicated. It's intertwined, multi-dimensional. You mentioned refineries. That's true. But let's imagine that they all stop at the same time. First, we will have lines at gas stations, and then we would face a huge economic crisis because we would run out of diesel, simply. In Europe, every hiccup in every European refinery causes a shortage of supply. Every downtime, every strike, every fire in any refinery across the EU immediately causes price hikes on stock exchange and possible fuel shortages. And you can imagine a crisis, what would happen if finally we would run out of fuel in Europe. So that's another component. Yet another are our internal regulations concerning reporting, ESG, sustainable economy. We should not only worry about the price of the oil, but where we will get it from. Qatar and the US said clearly that if we don't relax regulations related to ESG, they will just stop supplying, and that's it. They have officially said that. Financial Times wrote about it, and the Emir of Qatar and the US representatives told us that we have to limit the red tape as Europe. Otherwise, they will stop supplying the gas. It's only about the direction, but whether we will get it at all because of our internal regulations. That's another thing. Are the so-called aggregated purchases? The European would very much like to add another brick to federalization, and okay, we will help you buy this, we will buy it on your behalf, and you will just take it from us, and we'll have a better price, and the super state will achieve another stage of development. You have to take this into account, and we should defend our energy independence. There's Equinor as well. They changed the name from Statoil to Equinor. They are pretending to be green. They are greenwashing us, making money on oil and gas, and I think they will also be trying to make money on the crisis and increase their production and their supplies to Europe using various channels. And ultimately there's the UK. We're not sure whether they will be phasing out carbohydrates in a few years' time. This is yet another part or piece of the puzzle. Will we phase out Russian flows? Let's do it as soon as possible, because in the long term they are the most expensive, simply. Not just because of their aggression against the Ukraine. It was the impulse that forced us to do that. But to the whole imperial plans of this entity, whatever we call it, which for 1,000 years now has been playing the same melody and it's not planning to change it. So it's about where the eye of Sauron is looking. But their approach will not change. Yes, we have to depart, we have to phase out Russian flows, but what will they substitute them with? We will see. The US would like to supply as much as possible, but whether we will be able to import so much, we'll see. There's nobody who could answer this question, really. Thank you so much for input. Paweł, your comment about the role of the US. I would put it this way. Americans are and have always been focusing on the bottom line. It's all about the money. Money rules, regardless of who is in power. I mean, they are trying to hide it behind some ideological slogans, talking about the defense of democracy, the rule of law, etc. But their trade approach and their strategic approach is mercantile. They always look at their presence through this lens. Now, what you mentioned about this dependence, where you will just switch one dependence with another, first, we should look at it this way. On the side of Europe, we should also talk about diversifying supplies through our strategic interests. This is more of a strategic debate about the interests of Europe. Should we build the Silk Road from China, or should we rather go towards the US? What the Europe is doing today, well, poses yet another question. We're talking about phasing out energy resources from Russia, and we're happy about the EU adopting various legal acts and happily going towards it. It's not to think about importing these resources from other directions. They are thinking differently. They are thinking more under the paradigm of the new green order, new Green Deal. We are just limiting importing just to green everything, to implement new technologies. And that's everything it's all about. This is yet another dimension of the issue. Because when we talk about when we're buying gas from, we are just starting to talk where we will buy technology from. So this is the lever we should talk about. And we are not talking about this in the EU.
You almost read my mind, because I thought that at the end we should I should ask a question quite controversially. Will we be buying, will the EU need after 2028-29 a lot of Russian oil and gas? Won't the Green Deal limit it? So thank you for starting this topic, and could we have comment on that from you? from the MP. I believe that the process will continue, but it'll be slower than originally expected. The problems that the Commission has encountered, the European Commission and some of the European politicians, and they all having difficulties with accepting them and the problems. So the change will take place, but it will not be as quick as possible. As for the Draghi's report from a few months ago, the diagnosis is correct. We see the consequences of phasing out from carbohydrates and switching to the so-called green energy, switching economies to that energy. How dramatic the consequences for European economy is. So the diagnosis was right, but the cure is not right. So I believe that there is no return from that path for Europe, but our travel along the path will be slower. Thank you for that comment. I still believe that you have better insight into the European Commission and the anti-resource coalition and phasing out from the fuels is quite strong, despite of what the economies show. We can hear, at least on the verbal level, that the Green Deal is to stay with us. So what is the role of the resources in the European Union, especially when it comes to safety and security? Tymon, could you comment on that? Okay, the shadow fleet will come next. The question is a bit risky in political terms because it is known that there are various parties across Europe with different views on that. But if we take a look at the situation after 2022, when the resources exports were limited. In Asia, it dropped by 15%. So the drop was not good because energy efficiency did not go up in the meantime in Europe. It resulted from slower economic activity. Crisis and savings. Yes, crisis and savings. So given the current deindustrialization of Europe can be dangerous because of industrial risks. That's something that hasn't been discussed enough in Poland, and not only. It's the area that shows us that's sore point for the economies. There are attempts to resolve that problem, but the cures designed in the 2019 and 20 are much more difficult and much more expensive than it originally appeared. It still does not mean that the problem is gone. It's the matter of the solution. There is a need for certain visions, ideas, concepts, how to reduce consumption of fossil fuels. On the other hand, how to limit their economic reliance and spending EU money outside the EU. Then there is the reliance toward the producers of the technology, not industrializing the Europe. And so the phasing out from Russian fuels made the picture more complex, and that's a challenge that's still ahead of us. I cannot tell you what is the recipe for that challenge. But that's something ahead of us as a society. Will the EU Commission handle it? That's an unresolvable problem. It's a paradox. It's not only politicians or experts that say that, or some politicians that it's undoable, not feasible, but it's the industry that says so. presidents of companies say that they cannot electrify at that pace, or they upgrade their production given the Green Deal principles. We're simply not able to do that. Reliance on raw materials will stay with us. We haven't discussed rare earths and the dominance of China and the technologies, new technologies in that respect. We haven't mentioned the green hydrogen issues that has always been unprofitable. It's not just Draghi, but Letta and his earlier report with decent diagnosis, but the recipes are questionable at both authors. In the spring, we'll have another conference attended by both gentlemen, where discussions will cover speeding up electrification and decarbonization of economies, with keeping the industrialization level in Europe and getting rid of reliance on China. We'd all like to be well and rich, but it's difficult to attain. And I have another thought that nobody wants to say it's straight, but it has to be said. So, the climate objectives for 2040, that it's necessary, but no one wanted to say the number out loud. There are climate loans and the trading in emission certificates in countries outside of the developed world. So I think that at least the progress will be slower. I do not envisage changing the direction, but the pace. I certainly hope for a bit more concrete facts in the nearest future. One more thing that can fan hopes. Nuclear power. That's a difficult return to that technology or that source, but it seems that that's something that at the European level should be voiced out more loudly. It's one of the opportunities, one of the things that could help us reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. But I know that it's not the answer to the question, but it's an important puzzle in the whole picture. Paweł, phasing out from Russian fossil fuels means speeded up decarbonizations, or there'll be a moment for reflection. Talking heads just keep talking at different levels. But what speaks are acts. Actual acts. A very good proof of that, how declarations differ from acts, is Poland. Recently, we've seen a lot of non-green attacks on non-green policies, being too conservative in the approach to such things as wind, sun, and other renewables, that more is needed. Where are we now? What is real, that is acts, facts, show that this government is far from what they declare. What we see is, firstly, dedicated auctions for gas power plants. Secondly, change in the rhetorics, political rhetorics, shifting from gas fuels as a fuel of transitional fuel to gas that will be reduced very quickly, to gas as a stable fuel that will stay with us for a long time. Fuel that fuels our economy. So the changes at the level of acting. Oh, one more thing. Gas trap. Until recently, until 2023, we heard that Poland would be in the gas trap, and suddenly, in around 2023, it all ceased. It disappeared, and gas is a part of the mix. It seems that the green part is being hidden in the pocket. It just shows that the political narration is still valid. Gas and fossil fuels will stay with us for longer. Will there be any change in the paradigm? No, the fossil fuels will be there. We will need them at the level they are now at. We'll be slowly phasing out, but as we've heard, the industry will not let us to do it quickly. The technologies will not let us remain competitive. Look at India, look at China, look at steel industry. What we do now, we implement customs tools that are to protect us with lack of competition compared to other continents. Very briefly at the end, Mr. Minister, I can just repeat and agree with my colleague. On the one hand, I believe that there will be no rapid shift of the lever, but there will be delays in delivering the Green Europe concept. It's because of the industrial limitations. Which means that that's something we will not see. At this stage, I have to apologize for not being able to stay with you any longer, but my plane will not wait for me. Are there questions for our speakers? Do not be shy. Okay, then let's use the last 2 or 3 minutes for another question. I wanted to ask you about something we've touched upon only. How did Russia handle with limiting purchases of their fuels, despite the sanctions, including the recent sanctions announced by London and Washington? Is Russia still able to handle a problem like recent sanctions? That's a big topic, too big to sum it up briefly. Russia will do everything. They've shown that they can operate in an unorthodox way. They have cunning solutions, both political, administrative, and financial, which we've seen in popping up various companies, development of the shadow fleet, and the processes will continue. But that's a task for Western countries to prevent it, to counter it. It's like cops and robbers. Everybody's coming up with new things or new technologies. Cops learn it, then robbers learn it, cops learn it, and so on and so forth. But we need to sustain the political credibility, and which is not simple, of course, but that's the least we can do, and that's another challenge that's ahead of us. You need to remember that the previous packages were not fully implemented. When it comes to keeping up to what's been promised, especially when it comes to American administration, is something really questionable. So, is Russia capable of defending themselves? Let me put it this way. It's a much deeper problem of perceiving Russia as such. The basic mistake of many in the West is treating Russia and that the whole state, Russians and the state, as one of European states. It's not true. It's simply not true. And I believe you know that as an analyst and expert.
odrębna jakby jednostka
It's a
ze swoją,
separate
nawet ze
unit,
swoją,
separate
ze
entity
swoim
with
słownikiem,
their
ze swoją,
own dictionary and definition of the notions we keep using every day. They differently define state, democracy, independence, national pride, and so on and so forth. It impacts the way they are able to react and withhold or withstand various threats and challenges. Their capacity is much bigger than the European one for various reasons. Secondly, we still focus on European point of view of the whole picture, and that's a big mistake of ours. Some time ago, I was somewhere at the other end of the world, and I saw the map of the world, and the center of that map was the Philippines. We see Europe as the center of the world, which is not good because the center of gravity keeps shifting. And we are the beneficiary of our sanctions, our struggle, our fight with Russia. And China benefits from that, making Russia more and more dependent on the Middle Kingdom. Add Africa to that picture, and I know that Russia will suffer, but the beneficiaries will not be Western countries, but the Chinese dragon. To sum up, what's on our side of the barricade? Looking at the big geopolitical map and trying to be a decision maker, we need to focus to do as much as possible internally so that the sanctions and the bans are as painful as possible for Russia. As little circumvention, as few as possible of the options that of using Russian resources. Poland is a great example. Our Diversification Act that banned import of gas from Russia, we've had for a long period of time. I remember working on that regulation in 2016-17. For years on the local scene, we saw attempts of faking origin of gas. It came from everywhere but Russia. That's something we need to focus on because that's something that's within our reach. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, attention, and being here, and I hope to see you at the next panel.
Dzień dobry. Dear colleagues, dear friends, as we gather at the Poznan Economic Congress, the topic before us is essential to European long-term security, ending our dependency on Russian energy. This is no longer just a matter of diversification. It is about removing a long-standing lever of influence used by adversary against our economies, our societies, and our political system. The legislative file now entering trialogues on the phase-out of the Russian gas and improved monitoring of energy dependencies marks a historic turning point. The European Parliament is calling for a full legal ban on the Russian gas imports. I stuttered. I'm going to have to start again. This one has to be smooth. Dzień dobry, dear colleagues, dear friends. As we gather at the Poznan Economic Congress, the topic before us is essential to Europe's long-term security, ending our dependency on Russian energy. This is no longer just a matter of diversification. It is about removing a long-standing lever of influence used by an adversary against our economies, our societies, and our political system. The legislative file now entering trialogues on the phase-out of the Russian gas and improved monitoring of energy dependencies. It marks a historic turning point. The European Parliament is calling for a full legal ban on the Russian gas imports by 2027. This would close a vulnerability that has persisted for far too long. Russia has weaponized energy against Europe repeatedly, slashing supply in the dead of winter, manipulating our markets, exploiting contracts for political concessions, and funding its war machine with the revenues. This cannot be allowed to continue under any circumstances. The draft regulation does not stop at the declarations. It addresses the real loopholes. indirect imports via third countries and intermediaries, long-term contract rollover, and access to LNG terminals. It introduces tighter controls on storage, transit, and even petrochemical byproducts refined outside the EU using Russian crude. It also includes the critical provisions on the use of EU gas storage by Russian entities and tackles shadow maritime practices and murky shipping operations designed to obscure origin. This is about making circumvention not only difficult but impossible. The ECR position is clear. We demand enforcement that works, oversight that is real-time, and a system that leaves no room for gray zones. If this legislation is to mean anything, it must be implemented without exceptions and without delay. And let's be candid. Some member states have been slow to act. Others have quietly allowed Russian energy to continue flowing under the new labels and new contracts. This must end. National self-interest cannot allow to undermine European resilience. The encouraging news is this. The phase-out is technically and economically feasible. Demand has already declined. Prices have returned to pre-2022 levels. An alternative supply is not only available, it is increasing, with a stronger transatlantic cooperation and growing LNG imports from trusted partners. Parliament has done its job. The Council's position in place. The tools are there. What remains is a political will to agree on the best regulation. Let me end with this. Energy security is national security. Cutting off Russian energy is not a burden. It's a necessary discipline that will free us from costly dependencies. It's the only course that aligns with our values, our interests, and our future. I wish you all productive discussions and a clear-eyed commitment to deliver the outcome Europe needs. Thank you very much.
Dzień dobry Państwu. Serdecznie witam w imieniu europejskich konserwatystów i reformatorów wszystkich uczestników panelu oraz gości. Od ponad 3 lat Unia Europejska konsekwentnie dąży do ograniczenia zależności od rosyjskich paliw kopalnych. Traktujemy to jako kluczowy element naszej polityki bezpieczeństwa. Niestety, pomimo ambitnych inicjatyw, takich jak plan REPowerEU, państwa członkowskie nadal wydają miliardy euro na rosyjskie surowce, a pieniądze te zasilają rosyjską machinę wojenną. Największa i najbardziej kosztowna luka pozostaje import rosyjskiego gazu naturalnego, zarówno LNG, jak i gazociągami, które praktycznie nie są objęte zakazem. Szacuje się, że w 2024 roku Rosja mogła liczyć na ponad 15 miliardów euro przychodu z samego eksportu gazu do Europy. Co istotne, większość tego gazu to LNG, które można zastąpić dostawami z innych globalnych źródeł, bez problemu z przepustowością gazociągów. Rosja czerpie zyski dzięki 2 głównym kategoriom wyłomów. Po pierwsze, lukom zaprojektowanym w Unii, takim jak derogacje dla ropy rurociągiem Drużba. Po drugie, mechanizmom obchodzenia sankcji, czyli reeksportowania przez kraje trzecie, Indię, Turcję, Algierię oraz wykorzystanie floty cieni. Co gorsza, prawdopodobnie w ten proceder angażują się także niektóre kraje członkowskie. Przykładem jest niemiecka rafineria Schwedt, która oficjalnie importuje ropę kazachską, a w rzeczywistości jest to, szanowni państwo, najprawdopodobniej rosyjska ropa dostarczana na sfałszowanych dokumentach. Uszczelnienie tych luk jest krytyczne. Rosja wykorzystuje nawet minimalne zależności do celów politycznych. Pełne i racjonalne odcięcie od rosyjskich surowców jest niezbędne dla naszej suwerenności i wiarygodności. To odcięcie musi być trwałe i zakorzenione w prawie unijnym, a nie opierać się wyłącznie na tymczasowych sankcjach, niezależnie od ewentualnych rozmów pokojowych czy sytuacji na Ukrainie. Alarmujące są głosy o powrocie do business as usual. Widoczne jest to w sprzeciwie części posłów w Parlamencie Europejskim, którzy nie chcą trwałego zamknięcia rurociągu Nord Stream. argumentując możliwość wykorzystania ich w przyszłości do transportu wodoru. Dlatego kluczowe jest przyjęcie skutecznego, kompleksowego zakazu importu rosyjskich surowców z efektywnymi mechanizmami kontroli, przejrzystości, gwarancjami pełnego respektowania dla prawa, bez żadnych luk. Jeśli chodzi o zastąpienie rosyjskiego gazu, jest to realne, co potwierdzają analizy globalnej podaży LNG i zdolności europejskich terminali. Aby jednak zachęcać kraje trzecie do handlu z Unią Europejską na konkurencyjnych warunkach, musimy wykazać się rozsądkiem w naszej polityce. Konieczna jest rewizja niektórych przepisów, m.in. rozporządzenia metanowego, które nakłada na eksporterów do Unii Europejskiej trudne do spełnienia obowiązki, stawiając europejskich odbiorców w niekorzystnej pozycji wobec konkurentów z Azji. Dziękuję Państwu i życzę owocnej, merytorycznej dyskusji.